This is a critical operation. Pay attention to the details on your tags and equipment. We need precision.
A woman with grease-stained fingers was mocked for carrying fake military credentials until she hit a target 3 kilometers away without even looking. The sergeants who humiliated her went silent when a general revealed her classified past. Like if you believe talent comes in unexpected packages, subscribe for more incredible stories, and comment what country you're watching from. The Colorado sun sliced through the open hangar doors at Summit Creek Airfield, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, where military personnel clustered around testing equipment. The air buzzed with anticipation. Demonstration day always drew crowds, officers mingling with enlisted men, a few base reporters positioning themselves for good shots. Mara Ellington stood at the edge of it all, her tool case clutched in both hands, feeling every pair of eyes that swept past her. At 34, she moved with quiet precision through a world that seemed designed to overlook her. Grease stained her fingers despite her morning scrub, and her wire-rimmed glasses sat slightly crooked on her nose, a detail she'd stopped noticing years ago. Sergeant Cole Harrison noticed, though. He noticed everything that didn't fit his idea of what belonged on a military installation, and right now, his attention had fixed on the civilian woman who'd somehow found her way into his testing demonstration. "This is a joke, right?" Cole's voice carried across the hangar as he gestured toward Mara, his tone sharp enough to cut through the ambient chatter. Who hired her? The conversations around them faltered. Heads turned. Mara's breathing stayed controlled, but her knuckles whitened around the handle of her tool case. She'd heard variations of this question before, in machine shops, technical colleges, anywhere men gathered around equipment and decided who belonged. Lieutenant Riley Shore glanced between Cole and Mara, uncertainty flickering across her features. "She's here for the optical calibration support," Riley said. Though her voice lacked conviction, Cole stepped closer to Mara, close enough that she caught the scent of his aftershave mixed with gun oil. Support. He reached for her tool case before she could react, lifting it slightly to examine the worn leather and metal clasps. What kind of support comes in a case this old? Scattered laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. Someone in the back held up a phone. Cording. Mara felt the familiar heat creep up her neck, the same flush she'd learned to hide behind steady breathing and downcast eyes. That's when Cole saw it. A small metal plate riveted to the case's corner, tarnished with age and bearing a simple engraved marking, R79B. His eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. R79B. He turned the case so others could see the marking, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "That's not real." The plate caught the overhead lights, its surface worn smooth in places by decades of handling. Mara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-movement that only someone watching closely might notice. Her eyes fixed on the case in Cole's hands, not meeting his gaze, not giving him the reaction he wanted. "What is that supposed to be?" Riley moved closer, genuine curiosity replacing her earlier discomfort. "Probably something she picked up at a surplus store," Cole said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain, trying to look official. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the scent of drama. Whispered conversations started up. "Did you see that marking? Never heard of R79B. Probably fake." Mara's fingers had gone white around the handle where Cole still held her case aloft. She blinked once. Slowly, the kind of measured response that came from years of swallowing words that wanted to fight back. In the corner of her peripheral vision, she noticed an older man in veteran's clothing watching from the back of the crowd. Tom Briggs. According to the name tag on his civilian contractor badge, his face remained neutral, but his eyes stayed fixed on the metal plate with an intensity that cut through the ambient mockery. The hangar felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as more personnel gathered to see what the commotion was about. Camera phones emerged from pockets. Someone muttered something about stolen valor, though Mara had never claimed military service. Cole lowered the case but didn't return it immediately. "So what is it? Some kind of unit designation you found online?" Mara finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "It's mine. Yours." Cole's laugh was sharp. "Lady, this thing is older than you are." The shadows in the hangar seemed to deepen as the sun moved behind a cloud. In the momentary dimness, the metal plate seemed to catch and hold what light remained. its engraved letters throwing tiny shadows across the worn leather. Tom Briggs took a step forward, then stopped himself. His hand moved unconsciously to his shirt pocket, where the outline of something small and round was barely visible. The demonstration area hummed with the sound of precision instruments being calibrated. Mara had retrieved her case from Cole's grasp and found a workstation at the edge of the technical zone, where she could focus on her assigned tasks while the murmur of commentary continued around her. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning optical lenses with movements that spoke of years spent perfecting her craft. The thermal scope required delicate adjustment, a task that demanded steady fingers and absolute concentration. She'd learned long ago to let her work speak when words felt inadequate. "We need the thermal readout in 5, called a young technician from across the workspace. "On it," Mara replied, her voice calm and professional. She made the final adjustment to the lens assembly, then reached into her tool case for the calibration tool. As she did, her fingers brushed against something wrapped carefully in a faded cloth at the bottom of the case. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but the camera that happened to be following her work caught the moment. The way her hand paused, the slight intake of breath, the careful way she smoothed the cloth back into place without revealing what lay beneath. The young soldiers observing her work exchanged glances. "Civilian," one of them said under his breath, the word carrying just enough disdain to make his opinion clear. His companion snickered. Mara's shoulders remained straight, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The way she held her head, the precise angle of her spine. For just a moment, she looked less like someone trying to fit in, and more like someone who had once belonged somewhere else entirely. Tom Briggs had positioned himself where he could observe without drawing attention. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes tracked every movement Mara made, particularly when her fingers had touched whatever she kept hidden in that cloth. "She's different," he murmured to himself, too quietly for anyone else to hear. At her workstation, Mara completed the thermal calibration and handed the equipment to the waiting technician. As she did, a challenge coin slipped from her fingers, not accidentally, but with a kind of deliberate carelessness that suggested long practice. The coin hit the concrete floor with a distinctive ring that Tom recognized immediately. Mara bent to retrieve it, wrapping it quickly in the same faded cloth she'd touched before. But in the second it lay exposed on the concrete, the overhead lights had illuminated its surface clearly enough for Tom to see the familiar eagle and the number sequence that had been etched into its bronze surface decades ago. His breathing changed just slightly, but enough that the person standing next to him glanced over with mild concern. "You all right, Tom?" "Fine," Tom said, but his attention remained fixed on Mara as she tucked the cloth bundle carefully back into her case. "Just fine." The thermal readout came through clean, and the technician nodded his approval. "Good work," he told Mara, though his tone suggested surprise that the civilian had managed competent results. Around them, the preparation for the main demonstration continued. Officers checked equipment, enlisted personnel positioned targets, and the unofficial commentary about the morning's drama gradually shifted to speculation about the afternoon's events. But Tom Briggs stayed where he was, watching Mara work with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing something others missed. When she adjusted her glasses and returned to her calibration work, there was something in her movements that reminded him of training exercises conducted in darkness, where precision mattered more than visibility. Something about the way she held her hands, the economy of her movements, the unconscious way she oriented herself relative to the testing equipment. It all felt familiar, in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. The cloth bundle remained hidden in her case, but Tom had seen enough. The challenge coin, the metal plate, the way she moved through this military space with a mixture of discomfort and underlying competence, pieces of a puzzle he'd thought was lost forever. The demonstration area had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with officers forming a loose semicircle around tables laden with evaluation equipment. Riley Shore stood near the command panel, her tablet displaying ammunition specifications and weather data, while Cole Harrison positioned himself prominently among the evaluating officials. Mara remained at her workstation, but the focus had shifted unmistakably in her direction. The morning's controversy had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the base's informal networks faster than official communications ever moved. "We should remove her credentials until this is sorted," Riley said, her voice carrying the tone of someone trying to impose order on an increasingly chaotic situation. She gestured toward Mara without quite looking at her directly. There are proper procedures for verification. Cole seized the opening. Or she confesses. Then it's over. He stepped closer to Mara, lowering his voice just enough that his words felt private while remaining audible to the surrounding crowd. Admit you forged it, and you leave. Everyone wins. The hangar fell quiet except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional crackle of radio chatter. Phone cameras swiveled toward the confrontation, and Mara could feel the weight of documentation settling around her like a net. She met Cole's gaze directly, her voice steady despite the tremor that wanted to creep into her words. I won't lie. The response was simple, final, and somehow more damning than any elaborate defense might have been. It left no room for negotiation, no face-saving exit strategy for anyone involved. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone typed rapidly on their phone, probably posting updates to social media. The controversy was developing its own momentum now, beyond the control of any individual participant. Look, an older officer stepped forward, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Maybe there's an honorable way to handle this. He gestured vaguely toward the hangar's exit. No formal charges, no paperwork, just a quiet departure. Mara's hand moved unconsciously to her tool case, her fingers finding the corner where the metal plate was attached. The gesture was barely visible, but Tom Briggs caught it from his position at the crowd's edge. She shook her head, not dramatically, not defiantly, just a simple, clear rejection of the offered escape route. Tom felt something click into place in his chest, the way puzzle pieces settle when the picture finally starts to make sense. He'd spent the morning watching, evaluating, comparing what he saw with memories that had been classified away for decades. Now, watching Mara refuse the easy way out, he was certain the young woman at the center of this controversy wasn't trying to steal anyone's valor. She was trying to reclaim her own. He began moving through the crowd, not rushing, but with the kind of purposeful motion that suggested a destination. In his shirt pocket, his own challenge coin pressed against his chest, a twin to the one he'd seen Mara hide, carrying the same eagle, the same number sequence, the same weight of shared history. Near the evaluation table, a civilian official consulted a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age. A keen observer might have noticed the inscription on its cover, visible only when the light hit it at the right angle. Warden 3, Project 1979. But most of the crowd remained focused on the drama unfolding at the center of the hangar, where a woman with grease-stained fingers and crooked glasses was refusing to run from a fight she'd never asked for. The archive room occupied a corner of the hangar complex, separated from the main demonstration area by walls lined with maps and communication equipment. Tom Briggs had requested access with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of military experience, and the young sergeant manning the computer terminal had acquiesced without argument. What exactly are we looking for? The sergeant asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Tom held Mara's tool case with careful reverence, turning it so the overhead light fell directly on the metal plate. R79B, he said, tracing the engraved letters with his finger. Run it through the classification database. Mara stood beside him, close enough that he could hear her controlled breathing. She'd followed him without question when he'd approached her at the workstation, perhaps recognizing something in his bearing that suggested shared understanding rather than additional interrogation. The sergeant typed the designation into the search interface. For a moment, nothing happened except the soft whir of server fans and the distant sound of continued preparation in the main hangar. Then a file appeared on screen. Project 1979, restricted access, authorized personnel only. The metadata was visible, but the actual contents remained locked behind layers of digital security. That call sign, Tom murmured, his voice carrying a weight that made Mara look at him sharply. Warden 3. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mara's breathing changed, becoming shallower, more carefully controlled. Her hands remained steady at her sides. But Tom noticed the way her posture shifted slightly, as if old training was asserting itself, despite her conscious efforts. You know something about this, the sergeant said, though it was unclear whether he was addressing Tom or Mara. Tom leaned closer to the screen, studying the partial information that the system was willing to reveal. project dates from the late 1970s, personnel classifications marked as special assignment, a thumbnail image that showed shadowy figures in what appeared to be nighttime training exercises. "You don't belong where they put you," Tom said quietly, his words directed at Mara, though his eyes remained on the screen. "But you belong where they took you from." The sergeant looked confused. "Sir, I'm not following—" "Print what you can," Tom interrupted. "Metadata, file structure, anything the system will release." As the printer hummed to life, Tom reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a challenge coin. Its bronze surface worn smooth by decades of handling. He held it next to Mara's case, where her own coin remained wrapped in its faded cloth. "Same unit," he said simply. "Same eagle. Same number sequence." Mara's eyes filled briefly, but no tears fell. Instead, she reached into her case and carefully unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing not just the challenge coin but a dog tag, its metal surface etched with patterns Tom recognized from a training program that officially never existed. "How long have you been carrying these?" he asked. "Since I was 22, Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since the night they told me to forget everything I'd learned," the sergeant continued typing, pulling up additional metadata that painted a picture without revealing specifics. Personnel records with gaps, training schedules that referenced equipment not found in any official inventory, psychological evaluation reports that had been redacted to the point of meaninglessness. "This is real," Tom said, though he was speaking more to himself than to his companions. All of it. Through the archive room's small window, they could see increased activity in the main hangar. More officials arriving, more equipment being positioned, more personnel gathering for what was supposed to be a routine demonstration, but was developing into something else entirely. "Someone's coming," the sergeant said, pointing toward the hangar entrance where a group of senior officers had appeared. "Big brass by the look of it." Tom squinted through the window and felt his stomach tighten. General Patrick Roswell's staff car was pulling up to the hangar entrance, its occupant emerging with the kind of measured urgency that suggested crisis management rather than routine oversight. "He's here for the demonstration?" the sergeant asked. "No," Tom said, watching the general stride toward the hangar entrance with purposeful steps. "He's here for her." The mess hall had been hastily converted into a briefing room, its standard-issue tables pushed together to create a conference space that hummed with tension. Word of the general's arrival had spread through the base's informal networks, transforming what had begun as routine hazing into something that felt increasingly consequential. Mara sat at one end of the assembled tables, her tool case positioned carefully beside her chair. Tom Briggs had taken the seat to her right, close enough to offer support without making their alliance obvious to the growing number of officials who continued to file into the room. "What did you tell them?" Riley asked Cole in a voice that carried more concern than accusation. "Nothing that wasn't true," Cole replied, though something in his posture suggested he was beginning to question his earlier certainty. "She had fake credentials, that's what I reported." Through the hastily opened windows, they could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The rhythm was unmistakable. Military transport, moving with the kind of urgency reserved for high-priority personnel movements. Tom glanced at Mara, catching the slight tension in her shoulders as the sound registered. "You remember that sound?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. The way she held herself, the unconscious adjustment of her posture in the chair, the way her breathing changed, everything suggested muscle memory from training that had been conducted under conditions where helicopter insertion was routine. The rotors grew louder, then gradually faded as the aircraft settled on the tarmac outside. Through the mess hall's windows, they could see personnel in dress uniforms emerging from the aircraft, followed by a figure whose bearing immediately commanded attention, even at distance. "General Roswell," someone announced unnecessarily. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where his own challenge coin rested against his chest. He'd served under Roswell during the final phases of Project 1979, back when the program still existed in more than classified memory and redacted files. "Does he know?" Mara asked, her voice barely audible above the general conversation filling the room. "He knows," Tom confirmed. "Question is whether he'll admit it." The sound of boots on concrete echoed from the corridor outside, measured and precise. Multiple people moving in formation, getting closer with each step. Conversations in the mess hall gradually faded as the footsteps approached. A young aide appeared in the doorway. "General Roswell will be conducting interviews regarding this morning's incident," he announced. "All relevant personnel should remain available." Cole shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Riley checked her tablet compulsively, though it displayed nothing that required her attention. Other officers in the room found sudden interest in paperwork that hadn't concerned them moments earlier. Tom leaned closer to Mara. "When he asks, tell him about Warden 3, he said quietly. "Use those exact words." "I haven't heard that call sign in 15 years, Mara replied. "Neither has he. That's why it'll matter." The footsteps had reached the mess hall's entrance. A shadow fell across the doorway as someone paused just outside, presumably reviewing notes or receiving final briefings from staff. Mara's hand moved unconsciously to her tool case, her fingers finding the corner where the metal plate was attached. The gesture was becoming habitual, a physical anchor in a situation that felt increasingly surreal. From his position at the table, Tom could see the general's reflection in the mess hall's serving window, a tall figure in dress uniform, holding what appeared to be a small wooden box with brass corners, the kind of box used for storing medals, challenge coins, and other military memorabilia. The same kind of box Tom remembered from promotion ceremonies and retirement gatherings during Project 1979. The hangar had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with personnel arranged in rough semicircles around a central area where demonstration equipment shared space with hastily arranged chairs. The late morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting dramatic shadows across the concrete floor where General Patrick Roswell now stood. His arrival had brought a different energy to the space, the kind of focused attention that only comes when someone with real authority enters a situation that has spiraled beyond local control. Officers who had been content to observe from the sidelines now stood at attention, while enlisted personnel found reasons to position themselves where they could witness whatever was about to unfold. Mara remained seated near her workstation, but she was no longer peripheral to the event. Every conversation in the hangar seemed to reference her presence, every glance in her direction carrying weight that hadn't existed an hour earlier. General Roswell approached the center of the space with measured steps, carrying the wooden box Tom had glimpsed earlier. The box's brass corners caught the overhead lights as he placed it carefully on the equipment table, his movements deliberate enough to command attention without appearing theatrical. "I understand there's been a question about credentials," the general said, his voice carrying easily across the hangar without requiring him to raise it. "Before we proceed with today's demonstration, I'd like to review the matter." He opened the box with careful precision. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a collection of military honors and memorabilia, challenge coins, service ribbons, and in the center, a medal that bore the same eagle emblem that marked the metal plate on Mara's tool case. The silence in the hangar was complete. Even the background hum of ventilation systems seemed muted. "I recognize that marking," General Roswell said, lifting the medal so its surface caught the light. The eagle's etched details were clearly visible, as was the designation that matched the plate on Mara's case exactly. "I commanded Project 79B. She is not a fraud." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through the assembled crowd in the form of shifted weight, exchanged glances, and the soft sound of someone's breath catching in surprise. Cole's notebook slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Ma'am," the general addressed Mara directly, "would you be willing to participate in today's demonstration?" Mara stood slowly, her movements careful and controlled. "What kind of participation?" "Sir, show them what Warden 3 learned to do," the general replied. "If you're comfortable with that." The reference to her old call sign had the effect Tom had predicted. Mara's posture changed subtly but unmistakably, shoulders squaring in a way that spoke of training that had been dormant but never forgotten. "I'll need to turn away from the targets," she said. "The method requires indirect calculation." "Of course," the general agreed. "The range is clear to 3,000 meters." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 3 kilometers was an extraordinary distance for precision work under any circumstances, but the idea of achieving accuracy without direct line of sight bordered on impossible. Mara walked to the equipment table and began adjusting instruments with movements that spoke of absolute familiarity. Despite the years that had passed since her last official training, Her hands found controls and settings with the kind of muscle memory that comes only from countless hours of practice under pressure. She turned her back to the range, facing the assembled crowd instead of the targets. Her breathing slowed, became rhythmic and controlled. The hangar fell silent except for the soft electronic sounds of the measurement equipment she was adjusting by touch alone. The general stepped back, giving her space to work. "Range is clear," he announced. "Observer stations, report ready." The measurement took 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which Mara stood with her back to the 3-kilometer range. Her hands moving across instruments with a precision that seemed to bypass conscious thought. The hangar remained absolutely silent, except for the soft electronic beeps of calibration equipment and the distant sound of wind moving across the airfield. She worked with mathematical calculations that existed somewhere between instinct and training, processing atmospheric data, wind patterns, and thermal variations through methods that had been classified away decades ago. Her fingers found controls without looking, made adjustments based on sensor readings that painted pictures in her mind of trajectories invisible to everyone else. The target, a standard precision marker positioned at maximum demonstration range, waited in the Colorado distance, far beyond normal visual range, while spectators watched a woman with crooked glasses and grease-stained fingers perform calculations that shouldn't have been possible. General Roswell observed from a position where he could see both Mara's work and the electronic displays that would register results. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Tom Briggs caught the slight tension in his posture that suggested genuine uncertainty about the outcome. The final calculation required Mara to input a trajectory based entirely on indirect readings. Wind speed from thermal sensors, atmospheric pressure from barometric displays, distance confirmed by electronic ranging that she interpreted through practiced understanding rather than direct observation. When she completed the input sequence and stepped back from the equipment, the hangar seemed to hold its collective breath. "Range control, report target status," the general said into his radio. The response came through speakers loud enough for everyone to hear. "Target acquired, direct hit, repeat, direct hit at 3,000 meters. The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of people trying to process something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Cole stared at the equipment displays as if they might change if he looked hard enough. Riley had both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with something that might have been awe or disbelief or both. The general nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than the simple acknowledgement it appeared to be. "Gentlemen, ladies," he addressed the assembled crowd, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You've just witnessed a demonstration of capabilities developed by Project 79B. This woman served with distinction in a program that required mathematical precision under conditions most of you cannot imagine." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "She earned the right to carry that designation. She earned the right to be here." Tom Briggs felt something tight in his chest finally begin to loosen. The vindication he'd witnessed was more than professional. It was the restoration of identity that had been taken away by classification requirements and institutional forgetting. Mara had completed her demonstration with her back still turned to the range, facing the crowd that had questioned her credentials, her competence, her right to be present. Now she stood quietly among the equipment she'd manipulated with such precision. Waiting for whatever came next, the general's radio crackled again. "Sir, target analysis confirms precision within acceptable parameters for classified operations. Equipment functionality confirmed nominal. Thank you." "Range control," the general replied. Then, addressing the hangar, "I believe that settles the question of credentials." The administrative processing took place in a commandeered office space adjacent to the hangar, where official forms competed for desk space with coffee cups and hastily assembled documentation. General Roswell had requested a formal review of the morning's events, transforming what had begun as workplace harassment into a case study in institutional failure. Cole Harrison sat at the far end of the room, his earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that he'd built his accusations on assumptions rather than facts. The official personnel files spread across the table told a story he hadn't bothered to investigate. Gaps in Mara's employment history that corresponded exactly with classified operations he'd never heard of. Project 79B personnel were authorized under special classification, the general read from an official document, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Participants were required to maintain civilian cover identities following program termination. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Riley Shore found herself studying her hands, uncomfortable with the realization that proper procedure would have prevented the entire controversy if anyone had bothered to follow it. "I only did what others expected," Cole said, though his voice lacked the conviction that had driven his earlier accusations. "What others expected," the general repeated, "was due diligence before making accusations about forged credentials." The base's legal officer, hastily summoned to document the proceedings, took notes with the mechanical precision of someone who'd seen too many cases of institutional overreach. His presence transformed the gathering from informal confrontation into something with potential career consequences. Tom Briggs sat beside Mara, close enough to offer support without appearing to influence the proceedings. The printed documentation from their earlier archive search lay spread across the table, showing metadata and file structures that painted a picture of operations most of the people in the room lacked clearance to discuss in detail. "The proper response," the general continued, "is a formal retraction of accusations and immediate reinstatement of full access credentials." It wasn't a suggestion. The general's tone made clear that this was an order disguised as a recommendation, carrying the kind of institutional weight that could reshape careers with a single notation in personnel files. Cole nodded reluctantly. "I'll prepare a statement," he said. "You'll prepare an apology," the general corrected, "to Mrs. Ellington, to this base's personnel, and to anyone who witnessed this morning's events." The legal officer continued taking notes, documenting what was becoming an official case study in how classified operations could create institutional blind spots decades after their conclusion. Mara's presence at the base had revealed weaknesses in verification procedures that could have implications far beyond a single harassment incident. "There's more," the general said, consulting a folder he'd brought from his staff car. "Project 79B developed capabilities that remain relevant to current operations. MS, Ellington's expertise could be valuable for ongoing precision training programs." The suggestion carried implications that everyone in the room could recognize, but only some were cleared to discuss. The demonstration of 3-kilometer precision without direct line of sight had revealed capabilities that transcended historical interest. "Sir," Mara spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun, "are you offering me a position?" "I'm offering you recognition of the position you never stopped holding," the general replied. "The question is whether you're interested in making it official again." The administrative office had been cleared of its official proceedings, leaving behind scattered paperwork and the lingering scent of institutional tension that accompanies formal vindication. General Roswell had dismissed the stenographer and legal officer, creating space for conversations that couldn't be documented in official transcripts but carried more weight than any formal proceeding. Mara sat across from the general, her tool case positioned beside her chair like a faithful companion that had weathered decades of challenges. The metal plate R79B caught the afternoon light streaming through the office windows, no longer a source of suspicion, but a tangible link to service that institutional memory had tried to erase. "I owed you this conversation 20 years ago," General Roswell began, removing his service jacket with movements that suggested the weight of long-carried responsibility. Without the formal trappings of rank, he appeared older, more human, marked by decisions that had affected lives in ways that couldn't be quantified in performance metrics or efficiency reports. The transformation was subtle but significant. Where morning had brought the commanding presence of institutional authority, afternoon revealed a man grappling with personal accountability for choices made under pressure from forces beyond military control. "The program ended so suddenly," Mara replied, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who'd learned to navigate conversations about classified operations. "One day we were developing capabilities that seemed essential to national security. The next day we were told to forget everything, start over as if none of it had happened." Tom Briggs occupied a chair positioned where he could observe both participants without seeming to mediate the conversation. His presence served as witness to institutional failure and personal vindication, representing continuity between past service and present recognition. Budget cuts and political pressure, the general explained. Though his tone suggested those explanations had never satisfied his own sense of justice, capabilities like yours don't fit well into conventional military categories. When oversight committees started asking questions about programs that existed outside normal classification structures, the easiest answer was termination rather than explanation. The words carried the weight of institutional convenience overriding individual recognition. Project 79B had developed capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of human potential under extreme conditions. But those achievements became liabilities when political winds shifted toward programs that could be easily explained to civilian oversight. Mara's breathing remained controlled, but Tom noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested emotional response being carefully managed. 20 years of civilian life hadn't erased the military bearing that came from training under conditions where emotional control meant survival. Some of us never forgot, Tom said quietly. We kept track. Where we could. Unofficial networks, professional contacts, people who recognize that capabilities like yours don't disappear just because official programs end. The general reached into his document folder and withdrew a leather portfolio that had clearly been maintained with care despite decades of storage in classified archives. Opening it revealed commendations, service records, and performance evaluations that painted a picture of exceptional service under extraordinary circumstances. Your official record shows an honorable discharge and civilian transition assistance, the general continued. What it doesn't show is that you earned these. The commendations told stories that couldn't be shared in detail, but spoke to precision work performed under conditions that pushed human capabilities beyond normal limits. Mathematical calculations conducted under extreme pressure, targeting solutions developed for scenarios that existed at the edges of military doctrine, training exercises that prepared personnel for situations most soldiers never encountered and hoped never to face. Each document represented validation that had been withheld for political rather than performance reasons. The gap between earned recognition and received acknowledgement stretched across 2 decades of civilian life, spent wondering whether service had been valued or simply exploited for institutional convenience. I only wanted my truth back, Mara said, her voice carrying emotions that had been carefully controlled throughout the morning's proceedings. Not special treatment, not public recognition, just acknowledgement that what I did mattered, that it was real, that it contributed to something larger than individual achievement. The general nodded slowly, recognizing the distinction between personal vindication and professional advancement. Military service created bonds based on shared sacrifice and mutual dependence, relationships that couldn't be replicated in civilian employment regardless of salary or benefits. Your truth was classified because it was valuable, he replied. We thought we were protecting national security by maintaining operational secrecy. What we actually did was protect institutional comfort at the expense of people who'd served with distinction under conditions most personnel never face. Through the office window, they could see the hangar where morning's confrontation had given way to routine operations. Personnel moved equipment with practiced efficiency, conducted maintenance procedures that kept sophisticated systems operational, carried out the everyday tasks that maintained military readiness without fanfare or recognition. The contrast was striking. Institutional machinery continuing its operations, while 3 people grappled with the human cost of decisions made for reasons that seemed increasingly questionable with the passage of time. Riley Shore appeared in the doorway, her posture suggesting uncertainty about whether she was welcome in what had become a private conversation. Her bearing conveyed genuine regret rather than career preservation tactics, marking a distinction that military personnel learned to recognize quickly. Ma'am, I wanted to apologize personally, Riley said, addressing Mara directly. I should have checked the archives before supporting any accusations. Professional procedure requires verification before action, and I failed to follow basic investigative protocols. The apology came with a kind of institutional honesty that acknowledged systematic failure rather than individual error. Riley's statement suggested recognition that the morning's events represented broader problems with verification procedures and assumption-based decision-making. I understand the pressure to respond quickly to perceived security concerns, Mara replied, her tone carrying neither acceptance nor rejection, but professional acknowledgement of institutional complexity. Military environments require rapid assessment and decisive action. Sometimes that creates conflicts with thorough investigation. Riley nodded gratefully, recognizing that Mara was offering context rather than absolution. The distinction mattered in military culture, where accountability and forgiveness operated according to different principles than civilian social interactions. After Riley departed, the general returned his attention to the leather portfolio, spreading documents across the desk surface with movements that suggested reverence for materials that had been preserved despite institutional pressure to dispose of inconvenient evidence. The position I mentioned earlier comes with consultant status, civilian contract, and full access to current precision training programs, he said. You'd be working with technology that's advanced considerably since Project 79B ended, but the fundamental challenges remain the same. The offer represented more than employment opportunity. It was institutional acknowledgement that Mara's expertise had value, that transcended the political considerations that had ended her original service. Modern military operations still required human capabilities that couldn't be replicated by technological advancement alone. What would the work involve specifically? Mara asked, her question carrying professional interest rather than desperate need for employment. Training precision specialists who work with advanced targeting systems, developing new calculation methodologies that combine human intuition with mathematical accuracy, consulting on operations that require split-second decisions based on incomplete information. The general paused, allowing the implications to settle. Work that matches what you've always been capable of doing, with resources that didn't exist 20 years ago. Tom Briggs smiled slightly, recognizing the irony in institutional needs that had remained constant despite technological advancement. They still need people who can hit targets without looking, he observed. Turns out that's a skill that stays relevant regardless of equipment improvements. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the office space and creating an atmosphere that encouraged reflection rather than immediate decision-making. Outside, the Colorado mountains provided a backdrop that reminded everyone present of landscapes that had served as training grounds for capabilities most people couldn't imagine. There's something else, the general continued, withdrawing a final document from his portfolio. Project 79B developed training methodologies that influenced special operations doctrine for decades after official termination. Your contributions continued to shape military capability development, even when your service couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The revelation carried weight that extended beyond individual recognition. Mara's work had influenced institutional knowledge that continued to serve national security interests. Despite official amnesia about its origins, the intellectual property of her service had endured even when personal recognition had been withheld. I'd like to see those methodologies, Mara said, her professional curiosity overriding personal considerations. Understanding how the work evolved might help with current applications. Full access to developmental archives comes with the consultant position, the general confirmed, along with clearance to review current applications and suggest improvements based on original theoretical foundations. The offer represented complete rehabilitation, not just personal vindication, but professional integration into ongoing operations that built upon her original contributions. It was institutional acknowledgement that her expertise remained relevant and valuable, rather than historically interesting. Tom Briggs leaned forward slightly, recognizing the moment when professional opportunity aligned with personal justice. It's what you trained for, he said simply. What you were always meant to be doing. Mara's hand moved unconsciously to her tool case, her fingers finding the corner where the metal plate was attached. The gesture had become habitual throughout the day, a physical anchor in conversations that challenged her understanding of how her service had been valued and preserved. I need to think about it, she said finally. Not because I'm uncertain about the work, but because I want to be sure I'm accepting for the right reasons. The general nodded, understanding. Take whatever time you need, the position will remain available, and the recognition is already official, regardless of your decision about future employment. The distinction mattered. Personal vindication was complete and unconditional, while professional opportunity remained a separate consideration that could be evaluated according to its own merits rather than emotional need for institutional acceptance. As the afternoon meeting concluded, Tom Briggs gathered his materials with movements that suggested satisfaction, with outcomes that had seemed impossible only hours earlier. The restoration of institutional memory had implications that extended beyond individual careers to broader questions about how military service was valued and preserved. "Tomorrow there's a briefing about current precision training programs," the general mentioned as they prepared to leave. "Invited observers welcome, no commitment required. Might help inform your decision about the consultant position." The invitation represented continued integration, rather than pressure for immediate commitment. Mara's expertise was being treated as valuable resource, rather than historical curiosity, marking a fundamental shift in how her service was perceived and utilized. Walking across the airfield toward the main hangar, Mara felt the Colorado wind carrying sense of sage and distance that reminded her of training exercises conducted under conditions where precision mattered more than comfort. The familiar sensations triggered memories of capability and confidence that civilian life had never quite replaced. "Different world now," Tom observed, noting her expression as she surveyed the modern equipment and facilities that had replaced the makeshift arrangements of Project 79B. "Different tools," Mara replied. "Same fundamental challenges. People still need to make accurate decisions based on incomplete information, under extreme pressure." The observation carried professional insight that suggested her expertise remained current, despite years away from military operations. Human capabilities that Project 79B had developed weren't obsolete. They were foundational to modern applications that required technological sophistication, combined with human intuition. As they reached the hangar entrance, Mara paused to look back across the airfield, where aircraft prepared for evening operations, under the vast Colorado sky. The mountain landscape provided perspective that reminded everyone present of scales that dwarfed individual concerns, while highlighting the precision required for operations conducted at the intersection of human capability and technological advancement. The ceremony had been planned during the afternoon's administrative sessions, but its execution transformed a utilitarian hangar into something approaching grandeur. The Colorado sunset painted the western mountains in shades that complemented the industrial functionality of military equipment with natural beauty that reminded everyone present of landscapes that had served as training grounds for capabilities most people couldn't imagine. Personnel from across the base had gathered in response to word-of-mouth communications that traveled through unofficial networks, faster than official announcements. The crowd remained manageable, perhaps 50 people representing various units and specializations, but their presence created an atmosphere of institutional acknowledgement rather than private vindication. General Roswell had positioned himself beside a simple table that held the leather portfolio from their afternoon conversation, along with new documentation bearing official seals and signatures that represented more than employment verification. The certificates and commendations spread across the table's surface told stories of service that had been classified away for political rather than security reasons. Mara stood beside the general, wearing the same work clothes she'd put on that morning, but carrying herself with posture that reflected official recognition rather than defensive uncertainty. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Shoulders squared in military bearing that had never entirely disappeared despite decades of civilian life. The metal plate R79B caught the sunset light, its engraved letters no longer a source of suspicion, but evidence of service that had been restored to institutional memory. The simple marking had triggered a day of revelation that challenged assumptions about how military capability was developed. Preserved and acknowledged, Tom Briggs occupied a position in the front row of gathered personnel, his own challenge coin visible in his shirt pocket as a reminder that institutional memory lived in individual carriers as well as official archives. The vindication he witnessed extended beyond personal justice to acknowledgement that Project 79B had produced results worthy of respect rather than burial in classified files. "Today, we correct the record," General Roswell began, his words carrying across the hangar without amplification. The acoustic properties of the space, designed for equipment testing rather than ceremonial speeches, somehow enhanced the gravity of his announcement. Ms. Ellington served with distinction in a program that developed capabilities beyond conventional military training. Her expertise contributed to national security in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged at the time, but deserve recognition now that political considerations have shifted to allow partial declassification. The general statement acknowledged institutional failure while celebrating individual achievement, striking a balance between accountability and honor that military ceremonies achieved when they focused on justice rather than public relations. Cole Harrison stood near the back of the assembled group, his presence serving as visible acknowledgement that institutional failures could be corrected when leadership chose accountability over convenience. His formal apology, delivered during afternoon proceedings and documented in official records, had been comprehensive enough to satisfy administrative requirements, while personal enough to suggest genuine regret. The positioning wasn't accidental. Cole's placement allowed him to witness vindication, while acknowledging his role in creating the situation that required correction. Military justice operated according to principles that emphasized learning rather than punishment. When errors resulted from assumption rather than malice, Riley Shore occupied a position near the middle of the crowd, her bearing suggesting professional respect that had replaced morning skepticism. The transformation in her attitude represented broader institutional recognition that verification procedures needed improvement to prevent similar incidents in future operations. The certificate I'm presenting represents official acknowledgement of service that was classified for reasons that no longer apply. The general continued, lifting a document that bore signatures from multiple levels of military hierarchy. Mrs. Ellington's expertise in precision calculation under extreme conditions contributed to operational capabilities that continue to influence current military doctrine. The certification went beyond employment verification to acknowledge intellectual contribution that had shaped military thinking despite official amnesia about its origins. Mara's work had influenced special operations training, targeting system development, and precision methodology that continued to serve national security interests. As the general presented the certificate, Mara accepted the document with movements that reflected military bearing. Despite decades of civilian experience, her handshake was firm, her posture straight, her expression controlled in ways that suggested training that became permanent character trait rather than temporary performance. "Thank you," she said simply, her words directed at the general but projected clearly enough that the assembled crowd could hear the acknowledgement. "For seeing me." The phrase carried weight that extended beyond gratitude to recognition of fundamental human need for institutional acknowledgement of service and sacrifice. Military personnel understood the distinction between employment and calling, between job performance and dedication, that transcended individual benefit. The ceremonial medal that accompanied the certificate bore the same eagle emblem as the plate on Mara's tool case, creating visual continuity between past service and present recognition. The medal's weight in her hand represented institutional memory restored, rather than new honor granted, marking the difference between belated justice and generous recognition. As the formal ceremony concluded, personnel began to approach individually to offer congratulations and ask questions about capabilities that most of them had never encountered. The informal conversations that followed carried more personal weight than official proceedings, representing acceptance by peers rather than acknowledgement from authority. Young technicians gathered around Mara with respectful curiosity about mathematical approaches to problems they'd previously considered beyond solution. Their questions revealed genuine professional interest in learning techniques that combined technological capability with human intuition in ways their training hadn't covered. "How do you calculate trajectory without direct line of sight?" asked a sergeant whose specialty involved precision equipment maintenance. "Multiple sensor integration," Mara replied, her explanation combining technical accuracy with accessible language. "Thermal readings, atmospheric pressure, wind speed measurements. You create a mathematical picture of conditions that affect projectile behavior, then solve for variables that direct observation can't provide." The explanation sparked additional questions about sensor calibration, mathematical modeling, and human factors that influenced precision under extreme conditions. Mara found herself conducting an impromptu technical briefing that drew participation from personnel representing multiple specializations. Tom Briggs observed the interactions with satisfaction that extended beyond personal vindication to recognition that institutional knowledge was being preserved and transmitted. rather than lost to classification requirements. The conversations around Mara represented continuity between past capabilities and future applications. "Reminds me of training sessions 20 years ago," he mentioned to a nearby officer. "Same enthusiasm for learning. Same recognition that human capabilities matter as much as equipment specifications." The officer nodded, understanding. Special operations training emphasizes adaptability over standardization. Personnel who can solve problems under unusual conditions are always valuable, regardless of technological advancement. As evening approached and the crowd gradually dispersed, Mara found herself standing in the hangar space where she'd been challenged, humiliated, and ultimately vindicated. The emotional journey of the day had compressed decades of uncertainty into hours of revelation that challenged her understanding of how her service had been valued and preserved. The space looked different now, less like an arena where she'd been forced to prove herself, and more like a workplace where she belonged. The transformation reflected changed perception rather than physical alteration, marking the difference between defensive positioning and confident integration. She approached her original workstation, where precision instruments waited for tomorrow's calibration tasks. The equipment represented continuity of purpose that transcended individual recognition. Military operations would continue requiring precision, regardless of personnel changes or political considerations. The challenge coin rested securely in her jacket pocket now, no longer hidden as protection against suspicion, but carried as reminder of service that had been acknowledged rather than dismissed. Its weight represented connection to community that had been interrupted, but never truly severed. Tom Briggs joined her at the workstation, carrying his own tool case with movements that suggested shared understanding of equipment that served purposes beyond immediate functionality. His presence represented continuity between past and present, between training that had shaped character and current operations that required similar dedication. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked, the question carrying implications that extended beyond routine work assignments. "Tomorrow," Mara confirmed, adjusting her glasses with movements that had become automatic despite their significance in marking her transition from questioned outsider to acknowledged expert. She looked out across the airfield where aircraft prepared for evening operations under the vast Colorado sky that had provided backdrop for training exercises conducted under conditions where precision mattered more than comfort. The mountain landscape reminded everyone present of scales that dwarfed individual concerns, while highlighting the accuracy required for operations conducted at intersections of human capability and technological advancement. The wind carried scents of sage and distance that connected present recognition to past service, creating sensory continuity that validated training that had become permanent character trait. The familiar aromas triggered memories of confidence and capability that civilian life had never quite replaced, but military acknowledgement had now restored. "Different equipment, same fundamental mission," Mara observed, noting technological improvements that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities developed during Project 79B. "People still need to make accurate decisions based on incomplete information under extreme pressure." The insight suggested that her expertise remained current, despite years away from military operations. Training that had combined mathematical precision with human intuition under extraordinary conditions hadn't become obsolete. It had become foundational to modern applications that required technological sophistication guided by human judgment. As the last personnel departed and security lighting replaced natural illumination, the hangar settled into evening routine that would continue regardless of individual presence or absence. Military operations maintained schedules that served purposes larger than personal recognition, though acknowledgement of individual contribution remained essential to institutional effectiveness. Walking toward the exit, Mara felt the weight of the day's revelations settling into understanding that would influence future decisions about service and identity. The vindication she'd received was complete and unconditional, while professional opportunities remained available for consideration according to their own merits, rather than emotional need for institutional acceptance. Sometimes the most extraordinary talents hide behind ordinary appearances, waiting for the right moment to prove that precision and dedication never truly disappear. They just wait for recognition to call them home. The ceremonies of acknowledgement matter less than the restoration of truth. but both serve essential purposes in maintaining connections between individual service and institutional memory. The Colorado evening provided perspective that reminded everyone present of landscapes that had served as training grounds for capabilities most people couldn't imagine, while highlighting the precision required for operations conducted at the intersection of human potential and technological advancement. Would you like another story?